Well, that's the sort of trite story that all these people who used to go to interview Mr. Kennedy, you get so tired of people asking for anecdotes. And he'd always produce this thing that Joe would have, and how can I say, because I never knew Joe. And obviously I suppose Joe would have run for politics, and then Jack being so close to him couldn't have run right on his heels in Massachusetts. Maybe he would have gone into something literary. But it's just not as simple as that story sounds. And then once Joe was dead, Mr. Kennedy didn't do any strange thing of saying, okay, now we run you. Everything just evolved. They came back from the war. I don't know.
I agree. The story has always sounded to me too pat and mechanical. Joe was a classmate of mine at Harvard. But
I've got a feeling, from what I think of Joe and everything, that he would have been so unimaginative compared to Jack. He would never have, I think he probably would have gotten to be a senator and not retired. I don't know, that's just what I'm thinking. The sort of imagination that Jack did.
Well, that's certainly, I knew him moderately well. He did not have the imagination or the intellectual force. Both attractive, charming fellows. Not very successful. I don't think Barry ever carried things to the prime president. The vice presidency then was on his mind sort of sometime before 1956.
Well, it's funny, they were talking about that in, I guess around October, November 1953 at the Cape. But yet I know the night that Jack ran for the vice presidency in Chicago, he didn't want to then at all. I mean, it was just a last-minute thing when Stevenson threw the convention open, and all that talking so much of how to do things at California in 1960, because no one was prepared. I remember being in that office and Bobby trying to get someone to paint signs. I mean, he hadn't had it, he wasn't trying for vice president.
Otherwise, when he came to Chicago in 56, he was not coming really to...
No, and he didn't want it. It was just when he didn't think, he thought Stevenson would be defeated, and it would be because, and one of the reasons would be because he would have been a Catholic on the ticket with him, so it could only have been a hindrance to him. But then, when all that thing got thrown wide open, I don't know who said make a race for it, or what. It just really happened that night.
Must have been some sense in his mind, because I remember Ted Sorensen in the freshman in Ted's mind coming to see me on the Cape that summer before the convention and discussing this, and I telling Ted that I was for it, and I knew other people who served work for it. I remember then Ted had a memorandum prepared on the Catholic vote.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. I didn't realize it was then. The funny thing with Jack that would make it very hard in these interviews for me to sound as if I make sense is that he never spoke of this sort of secret objectives or plotting things. Life with him was always so fast, or what you were doing that day. He always talked at home what he was thinking about, and people. And when people say he never talked about politics at home, but it's all that was talked about. But he'd never sort of plot little goals and tell you when he was aiming. But then in life with him was just so fast that it isn't until you look back that you see what happened then.
Mm-hmm. And life isn't like that anyway. I don't think people have objectives they sort of opt to reach. They're things that organic and emerge as they continue living, which are inclined to, but not very consciously striven for. And when you do that, you get a kind of mixed business. On track there, the president lives so intensely from day to day that the kind of rather implicit in his career in both shape of his consciousness and destiny, rather than, I imagine, explicit in his mind or anything that he ever would talk about. But when he decided to run in for the vice presidency in 1956, what was it? Just the occasions, suddenly overpowered him, you think? Or?
Well, I was out at the convention then with him in Chicago, but I was having a baby. And so I stayed with Eunice, and he lived in a hotel with Tor. And I saw him, you'd see him in the day at the convention, you'd have dinner, but it was such, I can't tell you the confusion, and you should talk to Torb about that. He was so tired and he was working all the time. But it was, and every day was different. So I think it was when, I know he wanted, the worst fight in his life, which you should ask me about sometime, was when he got control of the Massachusetts legislature, and that was to lead the Massachusetts delegation there, wasn't it?
Yes, against Bill Burke.
Yeah, against Onionsburg. Because that was the only time of all the fights he's been through in his life, and I've really seen him nervous when we couldn't talk about anything else before. And to get so that was the big thing of all the spring, I guess, was to win that fight. And it really was on his mind all the time. So anyway, then he went out there as sort of an important person. And I guess both had rather unsatisfactory couple of meetings with Stevenson. And then suddenly there was that night, and I remember I stayed up all night at the headquarters, and Bobby came running to me and said, "We don't know anything, what do we do about Nevada?" And I was in a little corner doing something with envelopes or getting someone to make signs, and I timidly said, "I have an uncle who lives in Nevada." And nobody ever thought I had any political relatives or anything, but this uncle was a great friend of Pat McCarran. So we went in the little back room, Bobby and I, and called him up.
Who's the uncle?
Norman Phillips. And he's always been in Nevada. Married to my stepfather's sister, Esther. He was before that married to Ogden Nash's brother. Then she married Norman Phillips and lived in Reno the rest of her life.
And Norman Phillips was a Democrat?
Yeah. With Pat McCarran and all these sort of types of all. Well, anyway, he is I don't know, rather, I don't know if it's shady because I love him. But he's certainly someone to know in Nevada. And he said, all right, because Nevada hadn't been for Jack, and the next day all Nevada's folks were for Jack. So, all I know of that, when he decided, I don't know, but I just know that I knew that it was going for vice president for that day, that night. And before, I suppose it was Torb who came after he was positive in the room.
Well, yes, we'll talk to Torb. That's my memory, because I can remember Stevenson's decision to throw it open. And then, again, Ted or someone said staff that he touched it. But those, obviously, it was in the mind of some people around before I think it had become dormant and suddenly revived. Let's talk about the fight against Bill Burke. But really the fight against John Connick, wasn't it?
Yes, and again, you'd have to tell me about it, and I could tell you things that rang bells. It's
very, very problem was the control of the Democratic State Committee, and Burke had been put in,
Lynch there was.
And Lynch, who was our man.
Yeah.
And who has been state chairman for the years since. Kenny and Larry were in that fight, but were they in it?
I think so, yes.
They were, but I think neither of them yet had come on the Senate staff.
That's right. I think Kenny told me about that just now. Just a couple of weeks ago. It was always in the first place. Jack was traveling a lot then, but I can just remember every night talking. I remember at Jean's wedding. He was so busy up in Massachusetts, and she came. She had a dinner the night before she got married. Well, even Jack was going all around at that dinner. He was talking to his father, talking to Bobby, Torb, everyone. Sort of about this thing. It was just, obsessing it. Because it was going to be known she was married May 6th, May 19th. And I guess the vote or whatever it is was going to come up a few days later. The only time in my life I never thought for Jack. It was a little bit thoughtless. But I didn't really think that, because you could see how worried he was. Because all that night when everyone should have been making little toast to Jean and things, which they were, and he made a touching one, he was talking to everybody about the dinner, about that fight.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was just on his mind, and I've never seen him like that in the first Cuba, the second Cuba, any election. I mean, the election, the presidential election, when I think of how calm he was that night, you know, whether it would come out well or not, but still.
Mm-hmm.
That was just all that spring. And as I have, you know, you mustn't think it bad that I don't have all these political memories, because I was really living another side of life with him. But that was all in it. But I just remember that was a terrible worry all that spring.
I had the impression it must have been an awfully critical thing, because it was the first big test of strength within the party organization. I know Kenny's told me from time to time, we've been talking about people in politics, and he would say, so-and-so, he was for us in the birth fight, and which meant we forgive him everything else, or someone, he was against us in the birth fight. And this became the standard of judgment, which, you know, years later in the presidential years, will still be very much in everyone's mind.
And I remember all the people, it fascinated me, because when I came back from my honeymoon, I was taken immediately to Boston to be registered as a Democrat by Patsy Mulkern, who was called the China Doll, because he was a prize fighter once. He took me all up and down that street and told me duking people means shaking hands and things. And then there was another man with onion spirit named Juicy Granera. Well, I mean, those names just fascinate me so. You know, and sort of see that world and then go have dinner. So, then you'd be going someplace else. It just seems it was suitcases, moving, that. Then you go to New York for a couple of days. We never had our own house until we'd been married 4 years. So I can't tell you.
That was in Georgetown or out in the plain?
Oh no, that's right. We had one for 3 years in Hickory Hill. You know, we didn't buy a house. You know, but we'd rent for January to June. Then we'd go live at my mother's house, which was in Virginia, for the summer, because we didn't have a child for 4 years. So the summers we'd spend at her house, going up to the Cape when we'd go on weekends, and in the fall we'd stay with his father. And, you know, living right with our in-laws, and then we'd go to his apartment in Boston, and we'd go down to New York for a couple of days. It was terrifically nomadic, you know, and then we'd go away after Christmas or something for a few days to Jamaica or something. Such a pace when I think of how little we were alone, or always moving.
I know, political life, you were never alone in politics.
I'm never alone. Later on, Jack said when Teddy got married and got his house right away, what was the matter with me? Why didn't I get our house? And I thought, why didn't I sort of But, you know, you were just moving and everything was so fast. Then we got Hickory Hill, but that turned out to be a mistake because it was so far out of town. And that was the year after Jack's back. Well, again, we spent a lot of money to buy this house in Virginia, and I thought it would be a place where he could rest on weekends, the year where he'd be recovering from his back. And we discussed that when we bought it. Again, this shows you how he didn't sort of tell me what was ahead. Because once we got to the house, he was away every weekend traveling. So it was no good to him for a week. It was that much farther for his office. And then when I lost the baby that I, you know, made nurseries and everything for there, I didn't want to live there anymore. So that's when we moved. We rented a house. And the next year we rented a house in P Street, and then had Caroline and bought our house in 1957. Yeah, we must have had Hickory. No, 55. Yeah, I guess it was 2 years before that.
You got the N Street house in 57.
And I guess we got Hickory Hill the winter after his back, which was 58.
some people have speculated, and I have written that the operation sickness of the back is kind of a turning point. I've never known whether there was anything, so this is kind of a knowledge with FDR and whether really there was anything in that.
No, I don't think there's anything in that, and it's just so easy. Max Friedman said to me the other night, and when do you think the dedication started? Well, that just irritated me so. It was always there. And, you know, the winter of his back, which was awful, was just to keep himself from going mad, lying there, aches and pains, and being moved over side to side every 20 minutes or something, or beginning to walk, and just as he was starting to walk in crutches, one of his crutches broke. So then he was back in. You know, then he started to write that book, which he'd always had in his mind a long time, and he had Ellen Ross talked to me about that a year or so before. That's the one classic example of something I think of. He'd always got to write an article or something in that, and then so that whole week he started to search out articles to make a book. That winter, like he did everything, getting through an awful winter of sickness and doing the book.
The back had been an overhanging thing before.
Yeah, with the back, it just gotten worse and worse. I mean, the year before we were married, he'd take me out half the time he was on crutches. You know, when we went to watch a campaign before we were married, he was on crutches. I can remember my crutches more than that. And then in our marriage, he'd be off in a lap. And then something would go on. It was really, I mean, the problem everyone found later, he didn't even need the operation. It was that he'd had a bad back in college and in the war, and he'd had a disc operation needed. So all those muscles had gotten weak and gone into spasm, and that's what was giving me pain, the muscles. And so then he'd go and think if he went on crutches for 4 days, you know, to get everything better, but again, that was only weakening it. And it wasn't until after his back operation that the doctor who'd been his medical man, Epsom said to him, now I think I am at liberty to tell you something which I wanted to tell you before, but I didn't think it was correct to do that to Dr. Wilson, who was the back surgeon. It always made me so mad how doctors just let people suffer and don't say anything to hurt the other eminent physician's feelings. Then Dr. Shore told me about Dr. Travell. He was a woman in New York who lived down in 16th Street and doing terrific things in muscle. And Jack went to see her. She put in this Novocaine for spasms where she could fix him. I mean, life just changed. Because obviously after a year of surgery and a year out, his back was weaker than ever. If you don't think it was discouraging to have been through that year, worse than that.
In other words, the operation of 1955 was not
there was no more necessary than this for you to have a medical in it, and it was just criminal. But you know, all those bone surgeons look at X-ray. You see, Jack was being driven so crazy by this pain that he even said to him before it, we can't tell if it will help or not. And he said, and I remember his father and I, he said, I don't care, I can't go on like this. It was, you know, one chance in a million, but he was going to take it. And if it hadn't been for Dr. Travell, I mean, no one can underestimate her contribution. Then later on, when it was apparent that what he should be doing was build up his back with exercises, she was very reluctant to let him leave his Novocaine treatment, which by then were not doing any good. This is when we were in the White House. But she changed his life then.
And she came on scene in 56?
No, when did he have his back?
55.
October, no, he had it October 54.
The operation, it was the winter of 54.
Yeah, and he came back to the Senate June 55. So she must have come on the scene about June 55. He made a great effort to walk that day and walk around. And but he'd come back, we stayed at the Capitol Arms Hotel or something right near the Capitol. And he'd always come home in a hospital bed there. He'd walk all around the Senate looking wonderful, tan in his gray suit, and he'd come home and go in the hospital bed.
I thought one of the most terrible the Prabhupada was encouraged about half his days on this earth spent in pain. Because, around the White House, occasionally one could tell when he started to reach for something and then would stop or would pull himself short or didn't understand too much. Yet, I never, what I saw of him, he was total stoicism about it. Did he ever mention?
He was never, when you think how many people are hypochondriacs or complain, you'd say, I'd never like you to ask him how he felt.
Welcome to Little Atoms on Resonance 104.4 FM, a live talk show about ideas and culture with an emphasis on ideas of the Enlightenment.
Little Atoms is presented by Neil Denny, Portrait Radio, Richard Sampson and Becky Hall, as well as regular guest presenters.
Little Atoms actively promotes science, freedom of expression, skepticism and secularism.
Our guests bring ideas that are challenging, sometimes controversial, often polemical, but always interesting.
Good evening, welcome to another edition of Little Atoms, tonight with me, Neil Denny, and I'm joined by my guest tonight, John Mullen. John Mullen is a BBC producer and director who makes films about art, history and popular culture. He has made several films exploring the BBC archive, including the award-winning Kenneth Williams in His Own Words. He's appearing on Little Atoms tonight to discuss his most recent series, Great Thinkers in Their Own Words, which features rarely seen and newly discovered archive of the likes of Freud, Jung, Maynard Keynes, Hayek and Raymond Williams. So John, welcome to Little Atoms.
It's a pleasure. I'm a big fan.
Let's talk first of all about why this series, why you decided to make this series. The series is about, there's 3 programmes and they're basically exploring themes of great